Hey, how's it? I'm Dan. Look, Lost ruined me for television. I was introduced to it early in the second season, and I religiously watched each episode on the night it premiered for the next 4 years. I got the season set of DVDs because that was like a thing back then, and watched and rewatched them. I scoured them, each scene for clues, hints, Easter eggs. I participated in online theory and discussion forums and water cooler dissections after each episode premiered. I don't think I've ever been so hyped for a piece of pop culture media as I was for the conclusion of that show. And then, Season 6 petered out with a tired sigh, and everything wrong with the structure, economics, and politics of serialized television shows slapped me in the face. A scar never to be healed. I took the red pill, and I couldn't go back to the Matrix after that. I found out just who the others were, and there was no turning back. The way Lost was handled both by the powers that be and the creatives that produced it, the original 3-season plan, the studio demanding more because more Lost meant more money for them, etc., and my subsequent fall from emotional grace that I had with that show made it difficult for me to feel motivated to trust the investment of any real time, energy, money, or especially feelings into fervent television consumption again. I have not been proven otherwise since. Every time a new groundbreaking show comes out that sounds right up my geeky nerd alley, Stranger Things being a perfect example, I've been wary and tepid about watching it, at least until I know it's reached the end of its run and won't suck me in and string me along only to ultimately run out of creative steam and passion and become a derivative commodity that only wants my time and money but has nothing emotionally satisfying to give me in return. Early on in its run, Stranger Things sounded like the perfect show for me, being a fresh, new sci-fi horror thriller wrapped up in cozy 80s nostalgia. But I didn't jump on it right away because of how I've been burned by such great concepts before. But it just kept getting hyped up and growing in popularity, which compelled me to check it out before the second season aired. And honestly, I was hooked. I thought it was an almost impeccably written, directed, and produced television show that wrapped up perfectly. But I was curious to see if Season 2 had somewhere new to go, something new to say. Nope. Okay, Season 3 maybe? That just brought back all my angst and frustration over Lost. Will I watch Season 4? Probably. But only because I'm now a brainwashed consumer of that show and can't stand to not be in the know, even if I don't actually like the content at this point. And Stranger Things is just one example to me. Another one is that I was pestered to watch the OA on Netflix because of the mysterious puzzle PC nature of it. People were dying to talk about it with me, but I couldn't until I'd seen it. So I did, and I got really into it. And then its projected 5 seasons, with one of the most impactful and insane cliffhangers I've ever experienced, got canceled after only 2 seasons. And that just left me wondering why I even wasted my time to get all wrapped up in a story that I'll never know the end of. So, all that said, it may seem that watching the Netflix Marvel shows was never going to happen for me, especially since they all got canceled before they were properly concluded. I intentionally avoided watching them from the get-go because even though I'm into the Marvel Universe in general and was interested to see those characters dramatized on TV, I didn't want to repeat the same mistakes I've already made too many times of getting swept up in something before I had real reason to believe that it was worth my time. And for me, that means it must have a proper conclusion to its story. I don't expect perfection, just closure. So, my original plan for watching the Marvel TV stuff on Netflix, and like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter, and anything else that they would put out, if I was going to really watch it at all, was to wait until all those shows had series finales, then go back and watch them as complete works. But none of that mattered because it all got canceled. So I was like, oh well, there's other stuff to spend my time on. Rest in peace, Netflix and Marvelverse. But then Disney bought Fox, and the X-Men and Fantastic Four were confirmed to eventually be brought into the MCU. It was clear that with that huge news along with Sony sharing Spider-Man, that all bets were off about what Disney and Marvel wouldn't do with their characters. But then substantiated rumors of the Netflix Marvel characters being integrated into the MCU started to pop up. I realized at that point that even if the Netflix runs of those characters' stories weren't concluded, there was a good chance that Marvel wouldn't let them go completely or completely reboot them, since they had already invested so much money and had brought on so many fans with those shows. Except for Iron Fist, I heard nothing but generally good to great things about these shows. So, a few months ago, I decided if I was going to be all in with the MCU, especially since the kids are, so we'll all watch it together, that I couldn't leave the Netflix stuff out. Because, I am a completionist. What can I say? I put my pride aside, I gritted my teeth for some gritty takes on these characters, and I pressed play. And I am so glad I did. It couldn't have been a better time because as of recording this in early March 2022, Netflix's contract with Marvel just ended and the Defenderverse shows have all been pulled from Netflix. Allegedly soon to premiere on Disney Plus or maybe Hulu, we'll see. I didn't plan it this way, but my wife and I just finished the entire run less than a week before the shows left Netflix. Again, I'm really glad I decided to delve into them when I did because it's yet to be seen, as of recording this at least, if Disney is going to censor or edit or otherwise rework these shows to be more Disney friendly. Also, it was perfect timing because with Spider-Man No Way Home and Hawkeye, lo and behold, the respective Matt Murdock and Kingpin cameos actually got me excited because I was already invested in those characters and frankly shocked and impressed that Disney would have the guts to carry over such R-rated characters into their intensely PG-13 universe. So even though I'm way late to the game, I thought it would be as good a time as any, well, especially now with everything that's going on with the changeover of these shows and them being integrated into the MCU and everything, to give my thoughts and reactions about watching the whole Netflix experience back to back. I'm not going to dissect every show by episode or season or anything. This isn't going to be like a review necessarily. It's just my general overall reaction to the entire body of work as it stands. But I do want to look at each character series as its own thing overall before giving my bigger picture reaction to the Defenderverse as a whole. So let's get into it. First of all, just a general context and disclaimer. I was a consumer of comics as a kid, which was something that was passed down to me by my dad, who had a big collection of old school stuff, mostly from the 60s and 70s, and he had a lot of like old Hulk and Thor, Spider-Man, so actually like a lot of Marvel stuff, come to think of it. And then I was of the generation of like, really getting into superheroes when, even though I wasn't allowed to see it right away because of its tone and rating, but the Tim Burton Batman stuff and then the Batman the Animated Series really got me into like the DC universe especially. So with the exception of like Hulk and Spider-Man, I was never really too privy or interested in most of the Marvel stuff. At some point I became aware of like Daredevil and I knew what his powers were. I remember the Ben Affleck movie that came out, though I never saw it because I heard it was awful, and the Elektra movie too. And I had heard of Iron Fist and Luke Cage vaguely. Punisher, of course. He's one of the most iconic anti-heroes. I don't think you could, take a trip anywhere and not see like 15 Punisher stickers or decals on people's pickup trucks. But I'm pretty sure I never heard of the Defenders as a team-up, and I don't think I had any familiarity with Jessica Jones, though I was introduced to Brian Michael Bendis, I believe was her creator. I was introduced to him by a friend in college when he was doing his graphic novel noir stuff like Torso and Goldfish, and also his original run of Powers. So I wasn't surprised when I saw Jessica Jones and saw his name attached to it that it was good. But really, I didn't have any real background or intimate familiarity with any of these characters other than that some of them existed, or really even what some of their powers were or how they fit into the broader universe. So generally, I went in pretty cold and open-minded. I didn't have a lot of attachment to like what their costumes were supposed to look like or who, what the villains' backstories were supposed to be and all that kind of stuff. I was more just curious and, hoping to be entertained and have a good time. And I absolutely was, for the most part. So things kicked off with Daredevil, and I loved it. I right away really loved the tone. I loved how character-driven everything was for the most part. I like how even though there's differing opinions and narratives about how much it fits into the MCU, I like how there was a lot of reference to like big green guys, and you kept seeing things and hearing things about the incident. But the tone and, the color palette, the way it was presented was so much different than the MCU. It was really nice to know that Marvel had it in them, even back then, to allow themselves an avenue to differentiate some storytelling from the template that they had created with the MCU itself, but that it could still be connected. And it was kind of cool to think that, Iron Man could be out there equipping with Captain America, fighting Ultron and stuff. And meanwhile, there's still these very grounded, street-level superheroes that are struggling with a lot of the same smaller but equally important, challenges and thematic things. And I really see now why Daredevil is such a fan favorite and why people are so excited for him to be brought into the MCU. He is an awesome character. There's so much I could just kind of reiterate and echo that's already been said about all these shows. Daredevil in particular, about like the action, the staging, the choreography, the cinematography. Those long takes, well, we used to call them long takes in college. I guess now they're called like oneers or something. But it was just, a lot of those were just mind-blowing to me about how much choreography was put into not just the actors and what they were doing, but also the camera people. It was pretty mind-blowing. I mean, the action, even in that first season of Daredevil alone, was better than like anything that we have seen in the MCU or the DCEU, or like just most general action movies. They really took things to a new level, and I was really impressed that they allowed themselves to do something so unique and memorable. Because if I think back to most of like the fight scenes and the action, even in movies that I like really enjoyed, like Infinity War and the later two Captain America movies, when the Russo brothers came in and kind of shook things up with their more gritty style and everything, Daredevil just did all of it to perfection. I don't really want to just be repetitive and just say all the things that have already been said about all these shows. Rest assured, I generally agree with most people's reactions and reviews and takes on all of these aspects, especially like the action and the storytelling and the craft of the filmmaking and everything. So I don't need to get too nitpicky and nitty-gritty about all that. But I just wanted to recognize that Daredevil especially, I really, really enjoyed. That was like, I think, a big selling point to me, other than all the character work and development, was just how solid and how brutal and how hard-hitting the action was, and how you just felt every punch. And in particular with Daredevil, I loved how vulnerable he felt. It really gave the show stakes. He kept going up against people that could easily overtake him and end him, and not just physically, but also like thematically and emotionally. There was so much great writing and development put into everything that he was up against. Like most people, I wasn't as impressed with Elektra, though I thought her story, especially in season 2, was pretty good, at least as it related to Matt, though I never really bought their bond as much as I did with, like, I don't know, him and Karen, let's say. And all the other characters, especially his lawyer trio and Kingpin, they just had astounding foils for Matt Murdock. But I noticed something early on with the first couple Daredevil seasons, and then something that I'll get into more later. But my patience did get tried a little bit in most of these shows with how much of an ensemble they were and how much time we spent with the villains and the plot, where what I was really invested in was the main characters and their plights and their journeys and the emotional stakes that they were up against and their ideals. And I could be wrong, but it's been said repeatedly on every corner of the internet now. It's been commented on the fact that Netflix asked for a set number of episodes, and you could tell that there was definitely some filler and fluff to try to give 13 episodes. I think every show had 13 episodes in its seasons except for the second season of Iron Fist and Defenders, if I'm not mistaken. So just like network television, it suffered from some of the same kind of issues there, and like I saw those cracks really early on with Daredevil, but it absolutely did not ruin the experience or anything. And I had heard and I listened to a lot of reviews and things before watching them myself, so I knew this stuff was coming and I was prepared for it. So then there's Jessica Jones, and man, talk about a challenging show. Like, I really was invested in her character, and for the most part, the other characters around her. Trish got more and more trying as the show went on, but I have never been so disgusted and freaked out by a villain than Kilgrave. He was just scary. I mean, you have villains like Thanos, who are very powerful and conniving and manipulative, but they think they're doing good. At least, they've convinced themselves of that, even if they're like total psychopath or sociopaths. But Kilgrave was insane, and he was so swarmy and smug and arrogant and evil, and his power was so subtle. Like, he kind of reminded me of exactly, I'm rewatching all of X-Files right now with my wife. That's our binge show right now. And Kilgrave as a character kind of embodies like the same kind of frustration that I feel about X-Files, where there's always plausible deniability. And Jessica knows, and Trish knew, and all those people that were privy to the situation, Luke Cage, knew what Kilgrave was and what was capable of, but the wider world, Kilgrave had plausible deniability. liability. It was so maddening to see him keep almost getting caught or almost getting his comeuppance, and then the rug would be pulled out, and then it was so satisfying the way they finally wrapped up that season. But then, of course, he still, in some ways, had the last laugh because he got in Jessica's head even into season 3. I really enjoyed season 3, the season of which I really enjoyed, but I was really interested in that season and what it was really all about, because the first 2 seasons were so personal. In terms of the antagonist, you had Kilgrave, and then you had her mother as like kind of central villains. And so the emotional stakes were very ever present and very, specific to Jessica. But with this kind of like somewhat generic serial killer of the 3rd season, and I've been over serial killer media for a long time now. I don't find it interesting. It's so predictable. But this guy was definitely a good foil for Jessica and her crew. But there wasn't that same personal connection there, so I found that really interesting, because so much of Jessica Jones's story was about uncovering her past and figuring out who she really was and who she needed to be and stuff like that. The 3rd season, at least at first, felt a little bit less personal, less tied to her. Like she, in a way, could kind of walk away to some degree. And even though she tried, she couldn't with the other villains in the other seasons. But the way they brought all together and the way that it was all leading up to, and what it was creating in Trish versus Jessica kind of thing, I thought was really brilliant writing. Because it turned out that the big bad of most of the season wasn't really the serial killer guy. Like, he kind of was, but then he was just more of a catalyst for what had been gestating for like her whole life with Trish. So even though Trish as a character got kind of insufferable, the writing around it and what it all meant and how all those 3 seasons like kind of built up into that, I thought was really good. And I got to say that Jessica Jones, of all the, like, if you were to ask me which one was my favorite show, I think like it's kind of a shoo-in that Daredevil is as a superhero show, because he's just so cool and, he's so slick. He's the Marvel Batman. I got so many great Batman vibes from him. I mean, I felt like Daredevil was the best Batman show or story on screen that we've never got from DC. But like I was alluding to with Daredevil, all the other shows for the most part, except for Jessica Jones, really were more ensemble, sprawling shows and plots and stories. Where the thing that I liked about Jessica Jones the most, and I think I'll find her particular seasons more memorable individually than the others, is because it was really always Jessica's story. And she was, for the most part, was the focus of the show. She was a central character. She had the name of the show, and it was about her. Or like the way that a lot of people at the time had said that The Dark Knight Rises could have been entitled Gotham, because it really was more of an ensemble and it was about all these people kind of equally in this place, in this situation. That's really how I felt about all the other shows, except for Jessica Jones, was that they really were like ensemble shows that could have easily been called like Hell's Kitchen or Harlem or something. They were really about a lot of people, and, well, okay, I'll get in more into that later when I get into the general stuff, but let's keep going here. So next up was Luke Cage, I believe. Everything that I've said already I could say about Luke Cage for the most part. Daredevil really had the best action. I think that's kind of undeniable. It had the best like choreographed and most realistic and gritty, tangible action. All the other shows, even Luke Cage, who was, poised to be like an action hero, didn't have the same weight and impact that Daredevil did. But otherwise, I thought like the writing was on a similar par, and Luke was a great character, and I really liked how, and I should have mentioned earlier, but I did live in New York for only a semester, but I grew up going to New York because my dad's a musician, and he had musician friends up there, and we go visit people. I spent a good amount of like touristy time in New York as a kid, and then as a young adult, when I first went up to college, I really felt like there was nowhere else in the world that I could be or should be other than New York, because it was the the mecca and the hub of everything. Of course, I idealized it because of how many movies are set there, and idealize it for me. So I went to Hunter College for a semester on the mid-east side, and I lived in the Upper West Side. Actually, technically, it was in Harlem, 182nd and Broadway, but it was more of a Dominican Republic Harlem, really not too far from Washington Heights. But I was just an 18-year-old suburban kid, and I thrust myself into the big city. I was really naive, and I didn't really know how to make the most of it, so I went to college, and I made some friends, and hung out, and walked around the city, but I got like earrings in St. Mark's Place, and I avoided Times Square as much as possible, and I would take people people on the Staten Island ferry, to get a free, like, kind of tourist experience without having to pay to go up in the Statue of Liberty. And also, I guess it should be said that I was there during 9/11. That was the semester that I was there. And a lot of people, when I decided to leave after that first semester of college in the winter of 2001 into 2002, people would say, oh, yeah, I totally get it. Like, after 9/11, you wouldn't want to stay in a place like this. You must feel unsafe, blah, blah, blah. And actually, it was kind of the opposite. I left because of personal reasons. And, I wasn't in the right program at where I was at school. And I found a different program in Philadelphia to go to screenwriting, which was more of where I was headed anyway. But 9/11 itself and, the horrible tragedy that it was, when I first was living in New York, I definitely felt kind of like an outsider. I wasn't from there. And, I wasn't as like, I didn't know all the ins and outs. And, I was a suburban kid from the Baltimore, Central Maryland area. What did I know about living in the big city? So, I just felt kind of like isolated and alone. And then 9/11 was a tragedy that kind of, united not just that city, of course, but like the whole country, and at least for a brief time. And, it actually made me feel more like a quote unquote, like real New Yorker. So, relating back to the Defender stuff, like they kept talking about the incident, that was pretty easy to relate to, and like how it affected people's lives and had that widespread ripple effect, because that's, what 9/11 was, and it had that kind of effect on me, but it didn't make me want to leave or run away. It made me actually feel more at home in a way, because I had been through something so global and so life-changing with other people. We were all kind of in it together kind of thing. But anyway, back to Luke Cage. I generally really enjoyed that show. I can see why there was different reactions to the way it was edited and the music in it. I thought that was actually kind of cool. I really liked how each show had its own separate, unique feel and vision, and how each showrunner and directors of each series really kind of gave it its own voice and personality. Like how Daredevil was very much like a grounded, gritty, Batman-esque, kind of action drama thriller. And Jessica Jones was way more of like, she really was a detective, and it was a detective kind of noir show. And I loved the voiceover, how comic booky that was. How, the music was almost kind of like hokey, but it fit the genre so well. And then Luke Cage with its music was not just the music that was played, but how it was actually kind of like its own character, and the way that the music scenes were presented, depending on what was going on in the story, could, either be like a really interesting counterpoint or support of what was happening. Sometimes it played in directly to the plot, which was kind of cool. I was really frustrated with Cottonmouth, the way that he was handled at first, because I didn't find Mariah to be as interesting as a villain, I guess, than Cottonmouth. For some reason, something just didn't quite click with me with her. I warmed to her character more as time went on, and I really felt like there was this inner conflict with her, but at the same time was putting on this air of wanting to do good for the community and stuff, but she was just building this false narrative. And I don't know, I guess I never really connected with her. I just thought that Cottonmouth was way more subversive and dark and scary. Mariah was just not quite, I don't know if it was a development thing or something. I love that actress. She was phenomenal. I mean, Diamond Head was such a waste of potential, unfortunately. And that's when I thought like the cracks in the action really, especially because the way that Daredevil set the bar for how great action could be in this universe, that nobody else could really live up to it, which was really unfortunate. And we'll get to Iron Fist in a second. But yeah, overall, I really liked Luke Cage. And by this point, one thing that I also really enjoyed was the crossovers or the cameos, like where you'd have Luke Cage be a regular character in Jessica Jones, and the plots intertwined with like what Jessica did to Luke's wife, and Danny would show up later in Luke Cage's show, and vice versa. And, you'd have like Foggy or Karen, show up, and Punisher. I liked how they made sure that things were never too standalone, that it was a connected universe, but it was natural. They were all in the same city. Sometimes, just like with the Avengers stuff, sometimes you'd wonder if something major was happening, or like, well, where's the other superheroes? Like, why aren't they here? So it was nice to see that, like, sometimes they would show up, even if it was just like a quick walk-on. Let's get to the glowing elephant in the room. People really hated Iron Fist, and I went into it expecting to not like it at all, because just the vitriol and the disdain and the scoffing and about that show, I was just primed to like think that it was just going to be really bad. And I was pleasantly surprised that it was fine. Like, I really did not have a big problem with it. It's definitely not as memorable or stand out or is interesting. And I mean, everything about it was, even the good things about it weren't as good as even some of like the lesser things about the other series. And I understand why people didn't like it as much, but I feel like it was, I mean, I understand also that Daredevil gave such a high bar to all these shows right out the gate. That first season was so good and so strong. When you have a martial arts character where they can barely do martial arts without wearing a hood or something, and where the editing's pretty lackluster. The guy that played Danny Rand, he was so mediocre. I didn't think he was a bad actor, but he was just fine. He was kind of being outacted by everybody else around him, though. It was disappointing, but like I said, I was primed for it, so I wasn't like angry about it or anything. I was able to get through both seasons of Iron Fist with a general interest. But I gotta say, the biggest disappointment to me, I have a, going back to my childhood, because my the quick story is that when the Ninja Turtles movie came out was it 1989, 1990, something like that, and there were lots of fights breaking out across the country of kids wanting to be Ninja Turtles in schools and things, and my parents had some foresight and said, hey, our kids really like this stuff, we should get them into martial arts so they can see what it's really all about and not just pretend and like hurt somebody or hurt themselves. So, we were a kind of martial arts family. My twin brother and I, Dave, and my mom and my dad all did an introductory class for, this would have been the Japanese Ishinryu style, and when we were living in Buffalo, New York. And we bounced around to some other styles and schools because we moved around a lot after that. But I stuck with it until high school. My brother stuck with it through college, and my mom became a black belt and an instructor in Kenpo karate later on down the line while I was in high school. So needless to say, like martial arts films were a big part of our interest in our family growing up. So like, I got to see stuff like Enter the Dragon probably earlier than I was ready for, than I should have, but because we were looking at it from like a stunt choreography and martial arts kind of view. And, it's like old Chuck Norris, old Bruce Lee kind of stuff we'd watch. And then there was all these fun movies in the 90s because, like, karate was, like, really popular because the Ninja Turtles, too. There was, like, I remember this great Chuck Norris movie with what's his name from Sequest that died. It was called Sidekicks. I need to watch that again. That was really fun. But anyway, like, even if Iron Fist, like, wasn't good character-wise or plot-wise, I was at least looking forward to a good martial arts action show. And it had that to a degree. But, again, like, Daredevil just did everything so much better, especially the fact that it had the hand, it had ninjas, and it had martial arts and samurais and katanas, and like it just did not have the same effect that it could have in Iron Fist really needed to kind of like step up and take that to another level if it really wanted to stand out as the kind of genre that it was supposed to be, like a martial arts action thriller kind of show. And it couldn't with all the things that was holding it back. And I think a big part of that was the writing of the character Danny Rand. He was so angsty and whiny. I don't know if that was the actor portraying him or the writing as much. But yeah, I get why people weren't in love with that show, but I also don't get the hate. I think it was undeserved. It was fine. It was watchable. I'll remember some of the fun moments. Honestly, I really feel like Iron Fist, and they did allude to this by the end of the second season, but I thought that the Iron Fist should have been Colleen's show. She was a much more interesting character, and her connection with the hand and everything. And I was pretty excited and also disappointed that there wasn't going to be a season 3 just because Colleen, she got the fist and she was kind of like becoming this more fully realized version of herself and a superhero. And I wanted to see that. Like Danny Rand could have just not had the fist anymore and gone off back to Kung Lung and whatever. And I think that leaves us with 2 more shows. So we'll do the more character series and then the team up. Punisher. I heard a lot of different things about Punisher. And I know a lot of people had certain expectations for Punisher, like, for instance, Punishing, being, on that revenge path and everything. And I heard that some people were perturbed by the fact that it was a lot of slow character stuff and, like, a lot of quiet time and a lot of, like, hiding where he should have been out there like killing people. But again, I knew about the Punisher and I knew that like there were some mediocre Punisher movies that had come out, but I really don't think I'd ever gotten very deep into any kind of Punisher lore. I didn't know who all the bad guys were. I knew that he was on a revenge path because of his family, but I didn't really know what the context and circumstances were around that. So I was just taking it for what it was, and I thought what it was a really excellent character study of like post-war PTSD kind of stuff, integration, back into normal society. Is that possible? There were so many great things, that were explored with that character in that show. But there was also those moments where he would become the Punisher and just be the most like baddest those like stand up and cheer or like cringe moments of, you know, extreme violence. And I loved all the fact that there was all this conflict around what he was doing, but never really with him. He was such an interesting character because all the other characters in all the other shows had so much inner conflict. I loved that his only inner conflict, you know, was anything even worth it, because everything that was made life worth it for him before was gone, his family. He was such an interesting counterpoint of a character because he did have a lot of depth and he had a lot of layers. But when he needed to step up and take action, he didn't sit around and whine about it. And I got to say, that was one of my biggest complaints about, or really my only complaint about the season 3 of Daredevil, was how passive and kind of angsty Matt Murdock was for the beginning. And I understand it was given a place to grow and everything, but it was really a breath of fresh air to have Frank Castle, like, you know, not give a second thought to when action needed to be taken, even if it maybe wasn't the best course of action. Like, he at least would like step up and do something. There wasn't a lot of hand wringing with that character, and I was just really like on board with that. I felt that the thriller part of his show like really was thrilling. And the second season, again, the writing I found really interesting, kind of like the season 3 of Jessica Jones, but like in a, you know, different context, where I was kind of really curious, like, how is this all going to tie together? Is it going to tie together? Like, I really felt that the former gang member guy that was after the girl and then after Frank, how that was going to tie into the other plot lines that were going on, except they never really did. And I thought that was actually, you know, I expected to be kind of disappointed by that, because, you know, when you have all these pieces of a puzzle being set up and they don't ever connect together, it makes you wonder, like, what was, you know, the point of doing all that? Why not just focus on like one main thing? But in that show in particular, especially that second season, I thought it was a really good example of what the theme was how, like, you know, as much as you want to run from the war, metaphorically speaking, it's always going to find you, so you have to deal with it. I think they even said it in the show a few times, like, his war was on multiple fronts. So, you know, he had to prioritize and he had to act. I know a lot of people felt like he was being very passive and in hiding too much and sitting around brooding and things. You know, I heard a lot of criticism like that, but I never really felt like he was actually passive and inactive. I felt like he was always working towards something, even if it was like at the beginning of season 2, he was working towards finding some kind of peace or serenity. He was very active and intentional about like what he was doing with his life in context of the plot of that show. And even though it might have been really contrived and forced, it was kind of a bummer that Frank Castle wasn't in the Defenders, but I mean, he didn't really fit into the hand story. I get that, and I wouldn't have been surprised if all of these shows kept continuing, that Frank would have showed up in a later team up, or in, you know, like a different, like Jessica Jones season or something, or Luke Cage. As it stands, we only got that one Defenders, whatever they call it, mini-series. And again, that one too got a lot of flack. You know, when I first heard that they were going to do that, I was like, "Oh, cool! Like they're really going for it." But then I heard the reviews were kind of mediocre and lukewarm, because I guess with all the build up to it and all of the great writing that went into most of the shows that were leading up into it, people felt like it didn't really live up to that standard. How I felt about it, though, especially like not waiting for it for a long time, as people probably did when they saw like the first couple seasons of Daredevil and then Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, like there was like lots of time went by. But, you know, I watched them all in succession, and I felt like Defenders the same way I felt about Avengers Endgame, which was, it was a climax to a story, and it was exactly what it was meant to be. I totally get that, like, it didn't have all the same level of thematic content and emotional stakes. Like, it was very plot-driven, and the characters were just kind of reacting to stuff, but this plot had been building for all these characters, you know, for their season or two of time and development leading up to it. So, like, this really just felt like a big climax to the hand story, to where like Daredevil and Iron Fist especially were pushing them towards. And to me, I found it totally satisfying in that it was just the icing on the cake of this larger universe. Just like Infinity War and Endgame in the MCU were climactic parts of a larger story that couldn't stand alone on their own because of the serialized nature of the movies that Marvel had been making for so long now. The Defenders was kind of the same thing. Like, it would have been really weird and out of place almost for them to like put a lot of extra character stuff into it when you had so many characters to juggle and they were all meeting for the first time. I just really enjoyed seeing them play off each other, and that's why the first Avengers movie worked so well for me. I still herald it as one of the best superhero movies ever made, just because we had already met and got to know all of these characters individually, and then we had, a certain level of expectation of who they were and how they would be when they met each other, and the movie didn't disappoint. It gave us everything that we wanted, for like Thor and Iron Man meeting each other for the first time and stuff like that. Same thing for like, Danny Rand and Luke Cage and Jessica, dealing with the boys and like, Daredevil trying to do everything on his own and having to become like a de facto leader and everything. It was just like, I thought it was pretty fun. I didn't think it was like excellent or mind blowing or anything, but it wasn't meant to be. It was like Daredevil and Iron Fist especially were leading up to the Hand, coming to some kind of epic conclusion, and they did. Like, and those hallway fights and the team up fights were just like so much fun. And I thought they held pretty well to the standard of action. Maybe not up to the level of Daredevil, but it was definitely pretty good. And there were glimpses of, some of the fun Daredevil over the top, but also super grounded and gritty choreography and camera work and stuff that we had seen earlier. Okay, so before I get on to just like my kind of big picture thoughts about the whole thing as a complete work and wrapping this up, I just wanted to take a second and talk about the one season of all these shows that truly blew me away. Like when I saw the first season of Daredevil, I was like, man, this is going to be hard to top. And the first season of Jessica Jones, even that first season of The Punisher, I was like, whew, like this is something special, and I don't know if they're going to be able to, with all the baggage that's been created around these and the plot lines that are going and all the character stuff they've already explored, are they going to be able to, do like a season 3 of any of these shows and have them be, because, in my experience with a lot of serialized television, things tend to kind of peak around a second or third season, and then they spin their wheels for a long time. And I was so floored that Daredevil season 3 was one of the best seasons of television, one of the best pieces of writing and cinematic experiences that I've ever seen. I heard that people really liked it. I heard that it was really good, but I didn't know how good it was really going to be. And I'm so impressed that they were able to pull it off the way they did. I thought really what it did was it kind of perfected everything that every other show of the Marvel Netflix Defendersverse had going for it, but you could nitpick something here and something there in Luke Cage and Iron Fist and Jessica Jones. It's like, oh, they could have done different or better here and developed this more there. But Daredevil, I thought they just got it all right. And it's like they learned from everything that had come before it, and they really use it to their advantage. Especially because, and like I said earlier, with the 13 episode mandate and everything, every other show, even like the really good ones, felt like there definitely was filler, some wasted time, some stagnant time. But the structure of season 3 of Daredevil was always moving forward. It was always felt like it was logically building on itself and building towards a satisfying conclusion. It was never spinning its wheels, and there was never filler in my mind. The hallway scene in Daredevil season 1 and season 2 with the biker action, I really thought you couldn't top something like that. Not only the way that it was directed and choreographed and filmed in the prison escape scene. There's so many directors and writers and storytellers that could learn from stuff like this. Especially, I'm looking at like all these Marvel and Star Wars Disney Plus shows right now. My biggest gripe with all of those, aside from all the other stuff going on, is they have so much sitting down and talking about plot. It's obnoxious because it kills the momentum of the show. When everything's supposed to be tense and people are after you and you're trying to figure out and get yourself out of trouble or blah, blah, blah. And okay, well, let's just like sit down and have a meal and just talk about this. It kills the momentum. Like that can work if you're in a genre of like drama, or if your movie is Dinner with Andre. But really, like if you look at the core of what the prison scene was all about in season 3 of Daredevil, it was exposition. Matt needed to get some information. I think a lesser writer, a lesser director would have had him go in, learn some stuff. Maybe there would have been some bravado, like the people would have gotten in his face or maybe punched him or something. But they used that opportunity for him to need to get information to also put him up against like almost unbeatable odds and make this amazing action scene that had so much weight and stakes to it that I was on the edge of my seat. Same thing with the backstory exposition of Bullseye. The way that Kingpin, he's sat down at a table and he opens up a file and he starts reading it, and you're like, oh, here we go. I just assumed that they were going to do what they, most lesser directors would usually do, which is just show you like point of view shots and reaction shots of Kingpin reading a file, and it would kind of highlight some words on a page or show a picture. Maybe you hear some like ambient or sound effect thoughts in his head. But no, the director remembered, which is great, but frustrating when I notice when it's so conspicuous that people forget this all the time, that film and television is a visual medium. Pictures tell 1,000 words and stuff like that. So when people just sit down and talk and you're expected to just take in all the information from dialogue, it's really asinine to me as an audience member. I love film and I love television and I love graphic novels because of its visual nature. I'm a visual kind of oriented person. Even when I'm reading stories, I'm visualizing them in my head. So I loved how they did that scene where Kingpin, not only it wasn't just like a memory or projection, but Kingpin was there watching his perception of these events playing out, and we were really getting to not only learn about why Bullseye was the way he was, but how Kingpin felt about it and how he could use that to his advantage. It was really layered and interesting. And just like in general with the direction, there were so many great scenes and sequences, but just like one example in a very subtle way, but I thought was really powerful. Karen goes to confront Kingpin's fixer guy, Felix, in I think like a hotel lobby. And the way it was blocked, the way it was framed, I thought was just really good. Where it starts where she thinks she's the one in power. So he's sitting in a chair and she walks in, she's standing over him, and she's the one doing all the talking. But then as the scene progresses and the power shifts, it moves to her being the one sitting, and he ends up standing over her. So it's like a visual representation of what's happening in the subtext of the scene. And I love that kind of stuff. I don't always notice it, and I don't think I would have been looking for it as much in this show had I not already been so in tune with how much it was doing with the direction. But once the first few episodes went by and I realized like how strong the writing and the direction were, I couldn't stop noticing like how awesome it all was. And I could just go on and gush all day about all the things that I thought were great about that season. I really think that season in particular could be its own program or at least class about writing and directing in film school. You could just sit down and dissect it, and there's just so much to learn from it. A few other things that stood out to me about it in particular were, and this is true in some of the other series and seasons as well, but again, we're like just perfected in season 3 of Daredevil, which one thing was like the levels of conflict. There was always a external plot, thing happening. There was always like an interpersonal issue going on between characters, and there was always internal stuff that was, related to that or feeding off of that too. So you always had a lot of different kinds of conflict going on. It was never just one or the other. There was also always really tense. Like I was just riveted the whole time. There was never a moment where you felt like you could breathe. Even the first couple episodes are pretty slow, but there was, this kind of like rising tension around, the fact that Matt couldn't just hide in that basement forever. He knew that, and everybody else knew that. And as the more revelations came about, like, who that nun was that was taking care of him and why, the tension just kept building and building, and it came to logical, like, conclusive climaxes. It never felt like it petered out and then had to be rekindled, which was like something that unfortunately happened too many times for me in the repetitious nature, the kind of like circular nature of shows like Luke Cage and Jessica and Iron Fist. For instance, in Luke Cage with Bushmaster, there were too many quick power shifts when Bushmaster, took over Harlem's Paradise, and then was not even a whole episode where, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Like, there's finally somebody else in this seat of power that Mariah and Cottonmouth had been in for so long. They barely did anything with that before he was, usurped and then back on the run or whatever. I felt like they kept kind of pulling out the rug from things that they would build up to in those shows, and a lot of it was just because of the length and the certain number of episodes they had to get through, so they kept having to kind of stretch things. I mean, how many times did Mariah like go back and forth between like doing good and being evil and doing good and being evil, and Luke was helping her and then opposing her and helping her and opposing her. All of the shows were very thematic and had a lot of good thematic content for the most part. Maybe Defenders was maybe the weakest one. But in season 3 of Daredevil, I loved how everything just kept coming full circle for the characters and for the plot. Everything that was set up was paid off. And that was at like a tangible like plot level, and the plot also gave credence to the themes, or vice versa. The themes were never sacrificed. They were never in contradiction to what was going on screen. All the characters were true to themselves, and they had the same integrity the whole time, even when it was tested. Okay, so to wrap up, I'm just going to talk about my overall thoughts about the shows. I think I pretty much already touched on all this, but just to kind of like bring it all together. I never expected it to be, but also, I think it's fair to say that this run of shows, this stint of the Marvel Defendersverse on Netflix was not perfect, but it was really worth it. I'm glad that I invested the time in it. Even though none of the storylines really concluded definitively, except for maybe the hand one with the Defenders, and everything was canceled before, the character stories were wrapped up. I don't feel like I was losted with this, where maybe it was a good thing that it was canceled before everything was wrapped up, because it didn't give it a chance to spin its wheels too much and to peter out, to lose momentum and focus and just be a commodity like Stranger Things. Really, I think what it came down to, and the reason I enjoyed it so much, was that it took really big risks and it took big swings, and sometimes they didn't all hit, they didn't land. But I think overall, just taking those risks paid off. In general, it had really compelling characters, and it was interesting stories. It was grounded and gritty. All the shows, even the more fantastical stuff, stayed true to that original kind of feeling and tone. Like I said before, I think it added a lot to the tone and variety of stories that can and should be told in a universe. This is how I feel about Star Wars too, is that it tends to be so focused on the Skywalker saga, but that's really just a age-old tale of good and evil, or light and dark. That kind of thing can be told any way, anywhere, anytime. But the interesting thing about Star Wars that I think Disney Plus is starting to get a handle on, but they don't know what to do with what they have, is it's a whole universe of possibilities. When you set up a fantasy universe, just like Lord of the Rings too, it's kind of disappointing to me that they're going back to the well of the Silmarillion for the Amazon series, but also then trying to pander and change things to meet current mores and politics and stuff. But Tolkien created a universe. There's so much you could do with that. Why not tell different kinds of stories in different ways that are honest and have integrity, instead of just pulling from the same well? Especially because the MCU has become such a template, such a rote, predictable thing. I'm not saying I don't enjoy it, but when I walk away from our movie, even Spider-Man No Way Home, which I really, really liked, I have not felt super compelled to, watch it again as a movie. It's more of Marvel is really fun with the bigger stories that it's telling and what's going to happen next. To me, it's not as rewatchable as a lot of similar stuff of its ilk, like The Dark Knight, for instance, which is just such a compelling story in and of itself, regardless of what it's connected to and all the other stuff going on. This is how I feel about the Defendersverse, I think is more akin to how the quality of The Dark Knight, because I don't think The Dark Knight was a perfect movie by any means, but it was a great movie and a great story with great characters. And I think for the most part, that's really what the legacy of the Marvel Netflix Defendersverse is going to be, especially now as they most likely going to homogenize it more to the MCU. I'm glad these characters had a chance to breathe and tell their own stories before they got sucked up into the PG-13-ness and the washed-out grayness of the MCU as a whole. With all that praise given, I just want to say my overall reaction, I think the legacy that I'm going to walk away with when I think about this run of series in general, my biggest complaint, which I've already alluded to, is just the fact that they all had a singular character in the title. And yet, with the exception of Jessica Jones, really, I felt like there was way, way too much time and energy and momentum lost when they would focus on not just the side characters. I was always pretty interested in what Karen and Foggy were doing in Daredevil, or Marcus in Jessica Jones, or what have you. And those things always kind of wove back into the main story. So I was okay with B plots, but what I'm more talking about is something that you don't see as much in regular, superhero kind of stuff, is so much focus on the villains and their conniving and their stories. Honestly, I really don't feel like Kingpin, in my biggest drawback of Daredevil Season 1, for instance, was how much time was spent with Kingpin and just hearing his bureaucratic and, bravado talks with the other members of the Hand and who's really in power here and who's in control and what they were trying to do. Or, oh my gosh, in Iron Fist, it was just so much time spent with, I can't remember his name now, the father character who was kind of the big bad. And I really didn't feel like we needed to know that much about what they were doing. I mean, yes, you need to know what the characters are up against. You need to know what the antagonism is so you can understand what the stakes are, and what, the more you know about what a bad guy wants, the more it helps to understand the story and everything, of course. But I thought there was so little that was really, added by spending so much extra time with them that I just felt myself like, I wonder what Matt's doing right now. I wonder what Jessica's doing right now. I wonder what Luke's doing right now, as opposed to being like, it's so interesting to hear Mariah or Cottonmouth or Bushmaster or Kingpin or any of these big bads in these shows, like what they were doing when they would, be doing their seedy dealings and evil stuff in the background. When it came down to it, I thought the most interesting things that when they spent the time on these villains was like Kingpin's relationship with his love interest. I thought was a lot more interesting because it humanized him. It made you wonder, like, is this guy truly evil? If he can love somebody so much, does he really love her? Or is it more of like, he's kind of filling a hole that he wasn't able to with all of his power and money and everything? But I thought that was a lot more interesting than a lot of those like just dialogue exposition scenes where they would be talking about their dealings and plays and their chess game of crime and everything. That was one thing I really liked about season 2 of Daredevil was the Hand was very mysterious, and you got so little of like what was really going on. Most of it was exposed through Stick, and he was an unreliable source. So I thought that was really interesting way to give you information, but to make you question it and to kind of like build the stakes around that. Who's really right and who's really in the know, and like, what's Matt really fighting for? Does he even know? But in the end, really what it came down to for all these shows, I think what's going to make me want to go back and watch most of them in the future and stay with what they're doing in the MCU as they get more involved in there is just how good they all are, even Danny Rand, to a degree, of being well-rounded, interesting, likable but flawed, relatable but challenging characters, and how much the shows developed themes that were specific to those characters and their backgrounds and their desires. I just thought the writing is what it all started with, and what it always kind of ends with in a way is, and that's why I'm always interested in this stuff, to see if good writing is still valued in Hollywood. And I just really appreciate how every show, for the most part, had its own unique and distinguishable thematic content that was kind of like, the big question of the show, like, could Frank Castle be happy with everything he's been through? Could Daredevil defeat the demons of Hell's Kitchen if he couldn't defeat his own demons? Could Jessica Jones not just be a hero to other people, but see herself that way? So I look forward to seeing what they do with these characters moving forward. I'm glad that they are going to be doing anything with these characters moving forward. It makes my time invested in exploring these shows more worth it to me, even if they're never going to live up to what they originally were. I can't imagine that any Disney Plus Daredevil show is going to be at the same level as like Daredevil Season 3. But at least we have Season 3, and that can never be detracted from. And I really hope to see these characters not only interact with the larger MCU, but with each other again, because now that they've established that, it would just be fun to see them all in the same room again. And that's it for me for now. I never know how to end these things, so thank you so much for listening. Drop me a line. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Be sure to visit breathingunderwater.us. Follow me on Instagram at breathingunderwater1 and drop me a line at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. Please note that I do not claim any ownership of any media presented in this podcast, which is only used for promotional purposes unless otherwise noted. And all views and opinions are those of the person expressing them and do not represent any other entities discussed in this podcast.